Hello, I'm Mike from Nitron, and today I'm going to give you a basic overview of our motorcycle suspension upgrades. You can split those upgrades into two sections. We have the front of the motorcycle and we have the rear. We're going to start with the rear. Here we have our basic entry-level R1 shock. It's called an R1 because it has a single damping adjustment, but it also has adjustment for preload and for shock length, which are features that you'll find right throughout the Nitron shock range. It might be our basic entry-level shock, but it has components and features that are shared with shocks right the way across the range, to the point that you may well get a competitor, a rider in international motorsport, competing at an international level with a shock sharing components with an R1. Let's have a quick look at some of those key components. Here we have the main body tube. It's a hard anodized forged aluminium tube. It's roller burnished internally, which will give precise and consistent performance. Here's the typical piston rod. It's hard, chrome plated, ground, super high polished, and this gives the highest possible scratch resistance. The piston, as we said before, it's a single piston, large bore, high precision. That component is shared right the way across the range. Shock end caps and glands, all high precision, aluminium, lightweight, anodized components. And of course our springs, made specially for us to our specification. They have a flex light coating which gives long durable performance, and the quality of the material is such that throughout the life of this spring it will give consistent high performance. Even on the basic shock, there are options that you can choose. And if we have a look at this one we've got here, you can see, first of all, it looks a different colour. It's not actually a different colour shock, it's just a different colour spring. And we do offer the option. You can choose the Nitron blue, or you can choose the titanium black. Not only has this shock got a different colour spring, but it's also got a hydraulic preload adjuster. So let me just turn that round so you can see it properly. There we have the hydraulic preload adjuster. We have a flexible hose which leads to a remote adjustment knob. As I turn the adjustment knob, it automatically adjusts the preload on the shock, which is perfect if you've got difficult access. The shock's difficult to get to when it's on the bike. You don't have to fiddle around, you don't need any special tools. It can literally be done in seconds remotely. So that's really an option worth considering. Okay, moving on. We've looked at the R1 shock, let's have a look at the R2. And guess what? It's a two-way adjustable. The R1 shock adjusted both compression and rebound, but the adjustments combined, so it actually adjusts both at the same time. What we have with the R2 shock is separate independent adjustment. We've got the rebound adjuster at the end, it's similar to we had before with the R1, but as you can see here, there's another knob. You can probably see it says compression on it. That gives you your separate independent adjustment. So the look of the shock does change a bit also. As you can imagine, you've now got two separate adjuster mechanisms, so it needs a bit more space. We run out of space in the main body, so we actually have a separate reservoir, as you can probably see there. That reservoir, if possible, is coupled as closely to the shock as we can get it, but it does depend on the amount of space available within the bike. If we struggle a bit and there isn't enough space for this, we may well put a hose with a separate reservoir, but this type is what we refer to as a piggyback, because the reservoir is piggybacked onto the main shock body. The key features were exactly as you'd seen before on the R1. You've got the length adjustment, you've got the preload adjustment, and again, if you wanted to choose it as an option, you could have the hydraulic preload adjuster with the hose and the knob mounted remotely, and of course you could have the darker coloured, the titanium black spring as well. So again, It's a higher spec shock, and you've got the same options that you've got before. The actual internal working mechanism, the piston that I showed you, the actual body of the shock are exactly the same components as you've seen before on the R1. And that's one thing about the Nitron range. The key components, the components that really ensure the consistency and the performance of the product, carry right the way across the range. Moving on, R3. Guess what? Three-way adjustable. So now you have the rebound adjuster, again carried over from the R2 and the R1, but now you've got two compression adjusters. Let me just hold that up, hopefully you can see that. You can see I did explain that in some instances we can't fit the reservoir right closely to the shock. We can't do the piggyback style, so we do the remote. And this is a typical example of that. You've got the hose, it takes you to a remote cylinder, which is mounted on a hose. I don't know if you can actually see that. If I twist that, that has our unique Nitron 720-degree bi-axis hose fitting. That really means that when you come to fit the shock on the bike and you have to mount this reservoir remotely, it just makes it so much easier. You can see how it turns. You're never going to end up with a kink in that hose. But here we have the extra adjusters. So you've got now a high speed and a low speed compression adjuster, which is really the ultimate you can have in adjustability on a shock. You have to be a little bit careful not to go too far with specification. The R1 shock does a fantastic job. It's a performance shock. It will be a very worthwhile upgrade on your bike. The R2 gives you the separate adjustments. So if you're a little bit more confident with regards to adjustment, or if you have a specific requirement for independent adjustment, that's a good choice. When you go to the three-way adjustable shock, it does get a little bit more complicated. Unless you're going to race or you have a specific requirement, it's probably not the shock to choose. So apart from that, the rest of the shock looks familiar. Again, it's got the same body tube, it's got the same piston, it's got the same piston rod that we spoke about before. It's really down to the range of adjustments. The actual performance of this shock on any given setting will be as consistent as both the R1 and the R2. One thing worth pointing out, we don't just leave you to find somewhere to mount this reservoir. You will get a bracket in the kit with instructions telling you how and where to mount it. So that's the R3. Okay, so let's now have a look at the range topping Race Pro shock. Again, it's a three-way, similar to the R3 that we've just seen, but it has some slightly different features. The main one being that it's got a 46mm body and in turn a 46mm piston. The larger bore, larger capacity means ultimately that you can use this shock in more arduous conditions, you can use it in race conditions, and because it's got the high capacity, it will remain, the performance will remain more constant for a longer period of time. So it's fantastic for motorsport. But again, there's lots of features that are similar to the rest of the range. You've got the length adjustment there, you've got the hydraulic preload adjuster that we mentioned with the knob there, so you can adjust it remotely. Very slightly different shock this, because it does have some slightly different types of adjusters. You're probably used to seeing the clicker rebound adjuster that we had on the other shocks. This particular shock, and this isn't common to all race pros, some of them do have the type of clicker you've seen before, but this one has, I don't know if you can see it there, one that you need a little key, and that's generally used where access is difficult. So you wouldn't be able to necessarily get your fingers in to adjust the knob, so you use a little tool to get in, and as you can see it probably here as well, where you've got the high and low speed compression, just in the middle there is a little key again that needs a tool to operate it. They're not standard features, they would only normally be specified if they're required, if there's access to the shock or the adjusters is particularly difficult. But as you can see, it's the same shock that you've seen before. It's the Race Pro, it's a race winner. We've used this on motorcycles that have competed in and won races in both the New Zealand and Australian Superbike Championships. It's been run on works Suzuki's, works BMW's, and it is a very competent, very successful shock. Okay, and now we have something just slightly different here. This is actually our Adventure shock, or an Adventure shock from our Adventure range. The Adventure range pretty much follows the format of the range you've seen so far. There's an R1, there's an R2, and there's an R3. But the difference is, again, as you saw with the Race Pro, it's a 46mm body and 46mm piston. One thing I didn't mention before, actually, on both the Race Pro and the Adventure shocks, is they also have a stronger, tougher 16mm piston rod. The idea being, of course, if generally Adventure bikes are used either loaded very heavily, they're used off-road, they're used again under more arduous conditions. So the high capacity, the bigger piston can cope much better with that, dissipates heats much better, performance is more consistent, and generally it's just a stronger, tougher shock. So components again carried across, you've got the length adjuster, you've got the rebound adjuster you can see here. This particular one, as I said, it's a close coupled piggyback shock. So there's the separate reservoir, and you've got the high and low speed compression adjusters as you've seen before. This one hasn't got a hydraulic preload adjuster on, but generally that's a popular choice on Adventure shocks. Generally it's not unusual for people to load the vehicle or ride with a pillion, and the quick and easy adjustment that the hydraulic preload adjuster gives you really does make that altogether much more straightforward. Okay, moving on. We've looked at the monoshocks, and in fairness, monoshocks are what you get on most modern motorcycles, but not all. Some motorcycles do still have twin shocks, and of course we have a whole range of shocks for older bikes, twin shock applications, and here we have R1 twin shocks. R1, as you already know, one-way adjustment, and there it is exactly as before. You've got the adjuster which does the combined adjustment for both rebound and compression. And as you've seen before, you've got the length adjustment and the preload adjustment again here, similar to you've seen on the monoshocks, but of course there's two. The shocks are generally smaller because they don't need to be as big. They're 35mm bodied shocks, and in turn they have a 35mm piston. What's actually inside these is a smaller version, as you've seen before. You've got the same hard anodized forged body tubes. You've got the same titanium anodized fittings. So that basically summarizes the R1 twin shock. So here we have the R3 twin shocks, top of the range twin shocks. Being an R3, as you can imagine, they have three-way adjustment. As you've seen before, you've got the rebound adjuster and the high and low speed compression. You've got, again, we will be familiar, you've got the length adjustment and the preload adjuster here as well. All of the R3, well, I say all, but pretty much all, the R3 twin shocks have the close coupled piggyback reservoirs, so they look very much like this. So as I mentioned before, this is the stealth option. So it has the black springs, the black body, black reservoirs, fully black, or certainly as black as they can be. That's the stealth. So hopefully I've been able to give you an insight to the range of shocks we do for the rear of a motorcycle. Just to refresh your memory, we've still got the R1 here. Many of the components are similar. In fact, the performance and the real key components of the shocks are the same right the way across the range. What you're seeing when you move from an R1 to an R2 to an R3 is really a greater range of adjustment. So what we're actually seeing, if we flip that on its head, is you're seeing with the R1 shock that it is fantastic value because it shares so many components, so many features with those far more expensive shocks. So don't be afraid. Your bike may well come out of the factory with a two-way adjustable factory shock, but a two-way factory shock, the performance you will get, the range of adjustability you will get, does not compare even with our R1 shock. It may be our entry-level shock, it may have a basic one-way adjustment, but it is a very competent, excellent performance shock, and it will complement any bike that is fitted to. Okay, so we've cleared the decks now and we've got some new products here. These products are for the front of the motorcycle. We know all motorcycles have forks at the front, so to upgrade the front is a case of changing some or all of the internal components of the forks. One of the easiest way and most straightforward ways of doing this is to fit a replacement uprated cartridge kit, which is pretty much what we do and what we specialise in. Again, we have a range of products, starting at the entry-level 22mm cartridge. It's a TVT22. TVT is our unique system that we use for internals, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail shortly. We go from the TVT22 to the TVT25. There was then some upgrade options, and then we do fork options for certain bikes, but not that many. Okay, so let's have a look at the TV22. And here we are, TV22 cartridge. This one is for a Yamaha MT-07. So TVT, that basically means tri-valve technology. All motorcycle forks will have a separate piston in each front fork. The pistons are often referred to as valves, so you've got two valves. What we do with the tri-valve technology, the TVT, is we actually fit an extra valve in the base of the compression cartridge. Our cartridge kits consist of two different cartridges. There's a compression cartridge and a rebound cartridge. The compression cartridge does the compression damping, the rebound damping, but they're both independently adjustable. And as you can see from the top cap here, they can be adjusted externally. So imagine you're cornering, maybe mid-corner or in the braking zone, just braking coming up to the corner. The bike is nicely settled and balanced, the suspension is already doing its job, and you hit a hard edge bump or maybe a ridge in the road. Potentially the bike will become unsettled, the suspension will have more energy to dissipate, and it could throw you off course. Well, that's really where the third valve, the tri-valve, comes into its own. What it does, it instantly releases the damping pressure, and that means the suspension can cope, will be settled, you'll be able to continue with your braking or cornering, and continue relatively unaffected. Although originally intended to be a budget entry-level product, it's found its way into all kinds of uses, in particular motorsport. We've got some guys in America that race and win trophies on this product, which again just really underlines that at Nitron, it's not just a case of trying to make a product to a price. Performance is always very, very important to us. So moving on, 22mm. Next step up is 25mm. And guess what? It's a TVT product again. In this case, it's a cartridge kit again. So you get the two cartridges. As we've said before, one does compression damping, one does rebound damping. But TVT25 has a 25mm piston. So the idea being this is a more capable a performance step up really from the 22. But in reality, as I said, the 22 is a very good product. 25 is, certainly when it's a larger, heavier bike, probably likely to be under more arduous conditions. As we've discussed before with shocks, a bigger piston really just means that performance can be that little bit better, maybe a little bit more consistent. So for racing, for touring, for larger, heavier bikes, TVT 25. There are some options within that range. That's the basic product that we've looked at there. There is an upgrade available for the TVT 25. That is to have the Kashima coating on the outer piston tube. You can see it's a gold finish, but what it is, it's a Kashima is actually a process which impregnates the surface of the aluminium with a super slippery lubrication. The upgrade to the Kashima is an extra cost. It also then becomes a TVT 25 Pro. So there we are, that's the top of the range. Okay. So moving on from the cartridges, we also offer a very limited range of forks. When I say a range, it's actually a custom universal product. We call it the NTF 43 TVT. Surprise, surprise, TVT suggests that it has a TVT cartridge insert, and you may well recognise the end of that. So the principle of damping is exactly as we've spoken before, but we supply it in a traditional right way up complete front fork or pair of forks, really for custom builders. They can be fitted to some of the older bikes, not appropriate for obviously some of the very latest bikes, but it's a very neat product, priced quite competitively as well. Okay, well hopefully I've been able to give you a brief insight into the range of motorcycle suspension that we do. One other thing that's worth bearing in mind when you're looking at the Nitron range is that we don't keep any complete suspension units in stock. Literally everything is made to order. We keep a lot of components. In fact, we keep a hell of a lot of components, but the components are there to be able to assemble a shock or a cartridge kit specifically for you. You'll notice when you order that you'll be asked for details of the rider and the use and whether you have a pillion, for example. And all that's taken into account when we do the calculations to come up with a suspension unit which is bespoke for you and your requirements. That's something that other suspension manufacturers don't offer.